Today's show is sponsored by Linode. Simplify your infrastructure and cut your cloud bills in half with Linode's Linux virtual machines. Develop, deploy, and scale your modern applications faster and easier. Whether you're developing a personal project or managing larger workloads, you deserve simple, affordable, and accessible cloud computing solutions. Get started on Linode today with a $100 credit, especially for listeners of the Cloudcast. You can find all the details at linode.com/cloudcast. Linode has data centers around the world with the same simple and consistent pricing regardless of location. Simply choose the data center nearest you. You'll also receive 24/7/365 human support with no tiers or handoffs regardless of your plan size. You can choose shared and dedicated compute instances, or you can use your $100 credit on S3 compatible object storage, managed Kubernetes, and more. If it runs on Linux, it runs on Linode. Once again, linode.com/cloudcast and click on the Create Free Account button to get started.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hope everybody is doing well. Another Sunday Perspective show, and as we come into May of 2021, it's amazing that we're this far into the year. Time always goes fast, and I thought we'd dive into a topic that kind of came to me as I was watching a couple of different announcements over the last week or so come together. I'm not going to go into kind of the depth of the announcements. We'll save that for Cloud News of the Week, probably for the Wednesday show. But there were sort of three things that sort of caught my eye. One was Gartner forecast for both overall IT spending as well as cloud spending in 2021, kind of looking at those numbers and the growth, the breadth of those numbers. The second one was, all three of the major cloud providers announced their Q1 forecast or their Q1 earnings numbers, and then just kind of looking at the overall growth of those three things. And then finally, it was looking at Apple's earnings numbers came out as well, and kind of the overall growth of Apple and the iPhone and the smartphone market as a whole. And it kind of got me thinking, as I look at the smartphone market, which essentially launched around 2007, 2008. So iPhone came out in 2007, Android came out in 2008, and AWS launched around that same time. So you've got two kind of global technology phenomenons that both took off basically around the same time. And if I think about the cloud, public cloud is projected to be about a $330-ish billion market in a $4 trillion overall IT spend. So, a little better, not even 10% of that kind of overall space. And then you look at like the smartphone market, which essentially completely overhauled how we do communication, how we do telecommunication, completely changed the telecommunication market, has changed the home telephone market, all those sort of things, and that's pretty close to 100% saturation, or let's call it greater than 80% saturation of smartphones. And I kind of wanted to dig into like, why do we see such a big difference between sort of public cloud adoption, which, lots of people say, hey, it's great. It's this amazing new technology and it changes the economics and all these sort of things. Why is the adoption of public cloud so much less in the same time frame than the smartphone space? And so I kind of want to dive into that. Kind of want to connect a few dots there, and also want to sort of lay out kind of a premise that public cloud is still sort of in early days in terms of overall adoption and how big it might grow. So going to get to that right after the break. Today's show is sponsored by CloudZero. For software-driven companies focused on growing margins, CloudZero is the only cloud cost intelligence platform that puts engineering in control by connecting technical decisions to business results. By analyzing cloud services like AWS and Snowflake, CloudZero provides real-time cost insights that help you maximize margins. Engineering teams can answer critical questions like, who are my most expensive customers? How much does this specific feature cost our business? What's the cost impact of re-architecting this application? With cost anomaly alerts via Slack, product-specific data views, and granular engineering context that makes it easy to investigate any cost, CloudZero is your complete cloud cost intelligence platform, connecting the dots between high-level trends and individual line items. Join companies like Drift, Rapid7, and SeatGeek by visiting cloudzero.com/cloudcast to get started today. That's cloudzero.com/cloudcast.
Today's show is sponsored by Okta, the leading independent identity solution. Okta provides best-in-class authorization so your customers and workforce can safely access what they need most right when they need it from anywhere. Organizations around the world trust Okta's Identity Cloud to sign in, authorize, and manage users, whether it's employees, contractors, partners, or customers. And with Okta's developer tools, you'll never have to build authentication again. Our customizable code blocks are flexible and future-proof, with easy-to-use APIs and SDKs, so you can do less coding and more shipping. Okta is dedicated to building the most reliable, neutral identity platform because it means protecting more than a login. Identity is protecting people, their ideas, their work, their brilliance. It's protecting your future with confidence. Learn more at okta.com. That's OKTA.com.
And we're back. And as I mentioned in the top of the show, I kind of want to look at kind of compare and contrast two big giant trends that we've been looking at. And I brought them up just because there was a couple of announcements this week that sort of got me thinking about the numbers and the pace of change, the pace of growth, and so forth. And, so the first kind of question I posited was, is cloud growing quickly? And I think to a certain extent, if you said yes, most people would probably agree with you. If I look at AWS's growth here in Q1, it was up 30%. If I look at Azure's, it was up 23%. If I look at GCP, it was up 45%. And those are all on fairly large quarters. Amazon did about 13 billion. Azure did about 15 billion. Google did about 4 billion. And again, some of the numbers may be a little bit, what's counted. And we've talked about that many, many times in the show. But, for large businesses to continue to be growing at that pace, you go, wow, that's really, really good. And, especially then when you compare that to the pace of on-premises or sort of the overall IT spending, which is expected to grow about 8.4% in 2021, still a healthy number on top of a very, very big number. You sort of compare those and you go, oh, well, depending on how you look at that, the cloud providers are growing at anywhere from 4, 5, 6 times as fast as the overall market. So they must be growing really, really fast. Now, what I want to kind of look at is, well, they're growing really fast, and we think about, how big did Microsoft get back in the day? How big did Oracle get? How big did Cisco get? Or SAP? Or, any of the really, really big companies that were kind of dominant in the previous era where things were more on premises. We were talking about data centers. You could include Intel in that group. You could include probably several others in that space. How big did they ever get? Because we're now talking about a $50+ billion Azure or AWS. We're talking about a roughly $50 or $60 billion Azure cloud business and some of those other things. How big did they get? And if these cloud providers continue at this space, if we sort of just do some lazy math and just kind of straight line out that growth, you're looking at a $80+ billion AWS, you're looking at an $80+ billion Azure, you're looking at a $30+ billion GCP by the end of 2021. And those are pretty big numbers, especially if we compare them again back to, what Oracle, Microsoft, pre-Azure, Cisco, some of those others used to be. We're starting to get into similar types of numbers as, roughly decade-old subsidiaries or businesses. So, on one hand, you can look at that and go, yeah, the cloud is growing really fast, right? And different segments are growing fast and so forth. But then I compare it to, the smartphone market. And some folks are going to say, well, that's not a completely apples to apples comparison, but, sort of hear me out. They've both been around for about the same amount of time, right? They've both been around since roughly 2007, 2008, right? And they've had their fits and starts at the beginning, but essentially both been around changing the landscape since that same amount of time. If we look at the smartphone market, Apple announced their numbers. Their numbers were up bigger growth than any of those big three companies at a even bigger starting point, right? So the smartphone market mostly, again, on a revenue side, dominated by iPhone, even though market share is dominated by Android and sort of fragmented amongst probably a half dozen or so of those companies. But if we think about overall adoption of handheld smartphone device communication, that is somewhere probably up north of 70%, north of 80%, north of 85% in terms of worldwide adoption, right? It's completely changed how the application paradigm is, right? It's sort of narrowed it down to two standards. You've got Android and you've got iOS as the two standards. In the public cloud space, we have standards, but we're still more fragmented. We've got AWS, we've got Azure, we've got Google, we've got Alibaba, we've got IBM Cloud, we've got Oracle Cloud. We're having to write to multiple standards, right? So we still haven't sort of come together in terms of sort of consolidation around distribution or standardization the same way that we have in the smartphone space. And others would say, well, you're talking about consumer technology versus enterprise technology, and that's true to a certain extent, right? But plenty of people use their smartphone for enterprise types of capabilities, right? That was one of the biggest knocks on the iPhone and other things early on was, it didn't do cut and paste. It didn't do, your Microsoft Office applications. It didn't do the stuff. Well, that's all gone away, right? People use it for all sorts of reasons. There are plenty of people who, primarily work off of a tablet type of a device, which is essentially just a big smartphone. So some of those arguments are, they're fair, but they're not there. And what I thought I would do maybe is just sort of walk through, why haven't we seen 80, 70, 80% of the workforce of the applications in the enterprise, right, in the mid-market and kind of in business move into the cloud the same way that we've seen just such rapid growth in the smartphone space. And again, the reason I'm doing this is not to sort of, compare and contrast. Has Apple done a better job at taking over their market than Amazon has or anything along those lines? It's sort of, we're looking at, a lot of times people will go, wow, look how big the big three have become, is the game over? Is there any other place to compete? Are other vendors or other technologies in this space sort of, on the scrap pile of so forth? And I think I want to sort of make an argument that I think we're still in fairly early days, and it'll be really interesting to see, how long it'll take to get to even some sort of parity between the amount of spend that happens in the cloud versus the amount of, say, spend that happens in the data center and so forth. So kind of want to walk through a sort of a list of things that I see as to why the cloud isn't growing faster, and maybe we'll look at how that evolves and changes and so forth. So first thing I've got on my list is what I'll call data gravity. Right, we've talked about data gravity before on the podcast before. A lot of times it was a phrase that got talked about and sort of created by a guy named Dave McCrory, who years ago sort of brought it up. And it's been talked about all over the industry since then. But really, the idea that moving into the cloud is not a inexpensive endeavor. It's fairly expensive. Not only do you have to move the data, which is going to move from one cost of storage to another cost of storage. So it's not like it's a free move. Now, in some cases, moving the actual data, quote unquote, doesn't cost anything. But once you start storing it, backing it up multiple times for DR and so forth, the cost is going to be there. And it's a slow process, right? I mean, even though there are things like snowballs and the truck and all that other stuff, moving data is a slow process. So it's slow and expensive to move the data. So when your center of gravity is still data centers, moving into the cloud is still not necessarily an overnight endeavor, right? It could be weeks and weeks, it could be months, it could be just a lot of things going on, and a lot of times you want to keep using that data while you're making any sort of transition. So you may not be moving all of it at once. The second thing is in terms of economics, and we've talked about this both on this show as well as we just did an entire season of Cloudcast Basics on cloud economics, is data centers by themselves are long-term depreciation activities, right? They may be a 10-year depreciation, they may be a 20-year depreciation. So, even though companies may want to get out of their data center, there still is an element of that businesses, have to depreciate, and they may not want to necessarily accelerate the depreciation depending on, how laws work in certain countries and certain ways of doing accounting. So, there are going to be certain kind of gravity, if you will, depreciation gravity, that's also going to hold companies back to say, hey, maybe we leave some things in the data center for a while because we're essentially paying for these assets, or we're taking the cost of these assets against our profits and so forth. So, there is a certain amount of gravity, whether it's on the financial side or it's on the technical side, that resides with data centers. The third thing I had on my list was, app modernization. While it's talked about all the time, whether it's sort of the 4 or 5 R's of app modernization, refactor, rehost, replatform, those types of things, those are essentially kind of a small part of organizations' overall budgets, right? We've talked for a long time that, 80% of IT budgets tend to be keeping the lights on. Only 20% tends to be focused on new projects. And some of those dynamics have been changing over the last decade. We've seen, lines of business pick up their own budget, begin to build their own applications. But in terms of modernization, a lot of times once something exists, the budget to, find the people that are able to do modernization, which oftentimes ends up being outside consulting, being able to find the time, find the resources to do modernization is often considered fairly expensive and oftentimes not necessarily a huge part of budgets. And so, in terms of, even just lifting and shifting applications into the cloud, it's still not necessarily something that's going to be a huge, huge part of budgets. And so, we're going to have a lag of how long it takes to, migrate things into the public cloud. The next thing I had on my list is, you might say, well, that's fine. People may not necessarily want to do that, but a lot of these back office applications are just moving to SaaS, right? Whether it's, email or HR or CRMs or ERPs or any other number of back-end IT types of services that are provided. And while the numbers bear that out, and we've seen, thousands of companies in IT or in thousands of SaaS applications, SaaS is really now only growing at about 20%, and it's forecasted to grow somewhere in that roughly 20% range. So again, while we've seen certain things, move to the cloud in large amounts in terms of SaaS, whether again it's email or collaboration or other things, it's not necessarily growing even at the same pace as IaaS, right? So there's still a lot of gravity around applications that currently exist, and the migration or modernization of them is still not necessarily the top billing, which would, again, drive greater and greater public cloud usage. The next piece is, and this is something, again, that we covered in a session on Cloudcast Basics recently, if you want to kind of go back and look at it, but we've talked about it on the Cloudcast quite a bit, is cloud costs they're expensive. And they're not necessarily simple to understand. They're complicated. So while there are times when the cloud can be more effective, especially in shorter term environments or in dynamic environments in which you're scaling up and scaling down, or you don't need the cloud for long periods of time, or you want to do experimentation, right? There are tons and tons of reasons where the economics of cloud are going to make sense. When you get into the steady state kind of running of applications, so things that are going to run for many years, maybe don't necessarily need to take advantage of the scalability of cloud, they end up tending to be fairly expensive. And I know there's arguments that can be made of like, well, it includes, facilities costs, it includes energy and power and cooling, and, maybe you're not comparing apples and apples. But it is very hard to necessarily say that, cloud is 50% cheaper or it is 30% cheaper. Like, you don't really know. And, like I've said, there's cottage industries that have popped up all over the place to try and help you figure out cloud costing. But, we're already starting to see second and third generations of these things pop up. We're hearing about FinOps and other types of things coming along. But at the end of the day, while spending may not have been the most efficient in data centers and on-prem, in the cloud, hasn't necessarily gotten significantly better. So, the economic argument beyond certain use cases doesn't always necessarily tell you, this is a place where you're going to see huge cost savings or cost efficiency even, hence, going to accelerate that rapid usage. Another thing I saw, which is sort of interesting, and we follow this quite a bit because we get a chance to have a lot of startups on the show. We do, if you follow Cloud News of the Week, we're often talking about where acquisition or VC funding is being placed. And we continue to see VC funding investing in tech startups, which is interesting because at some point you might think, well, if all the money is going into the cloud, and it's being sort of consolidated around these 3, 4, 5 cloud providers, or even, the investment is only, if the investment was only going into like SaaS companies that were getting started, you might tend to tell yourself, okay, we expect to see this massive uptick of things happening in the cloud. And we're still seeing big tech investment in software. And in some cases, we're seeing it in hardware as well, but in software. And again, some of that software is available in marketplaces and so on and so forth. But marketplaces aren't the most efficient go-to-market way. And so you would expect to see more and more VC investment in SaaS. We do see it, obviously, but we still see massive investments in software for security, for infrastructure, for certain types of developer tools and so forth. And those things, tend to originally grow gravity or create gravity in data centers and so forth. So, the VC community hasn't seen to where they don't want to invest in those things, or they're moving their investments into other stuff. We are seeing them moving higher in the stack, and some of those things equate into SaaS and so forth. So, don't read into it as, they're only investing in things that will be software into data centers. But, we still see a market and a viability of the market that the VC community, who expects to see large returns, is still investing around software. In some cases, it's things that were based on open source. It's some things that's proprietary, but they're not entirely betting on things being in the cloud. And they realize the competitive nature of competing against the cloud providers. So interesting sort of trends to watch. Next thing we had on the list is security. And security has always been, no matter what survey you look at, and the trends vary a little bit year to year, but security for the most part is always a top 3 priority. If you talk to any IT organization, you talk to any business leader, security is always at the top of their list or somewhere near the top of their list. And while they have to be thinking about security both in their data centers and in the public cloud, it's not as if the cloud has made security simpler, right? To a certain extent, it does made security better. It's sort of secure by default, if you will, at least for certain aspects of what you do. But it's still complicated, right? So it hasn't necessarily made it simpler. It has offloaded a little bit. There's these shared responsibility models that we've talked about a lot. You don't necessarily have to think about as many moving parts, but it's not like you can easily point to the cloud and say, "Hey, there's never any." Reports of there's no more hacks. There's no more leaks of data. There's no more open buckets on S3. There's no more. I mean, those things still happen. And so, there are still people that have concerns about the security in the cloud. How do they learn how to do security in the cloud? How do they teach their auditors what's happening in the cloud? And so again, this isn't a knock on what goes on in the cloud. It's just why hasn't the cloud reached 70 or 80% adoption, and security is one of those areas that still isn't simple enough, isn't well known enough, and there aren't enough skill sets yet in the cloud. Everything from deployment to day 2 maintenance to troubleshooting to auditing and so forth, to where people go, oh, the cloud is just secure, right? Next thing I had on my list was, and this surprises a lot of people all the time if you don't work in this space, but there are a huge number of enterprises, of remote offices, of government activities, whether they're civilian or military, financial services that aren't connected to the internet. And people are like, well, wait a second. Everything connects to the internet these days. Well, not necessarily. I mean, there is a huge amount of disconnected, if you will, or air-gapped, whatever word makes sense, that are very hard to replicate into the cloud. And the cloud is doing more and more things to make it so you have, private VPCs or private VNets and so on and so forth. But again, when you have things that live in the data center and not only live in the data center, but aren't connected to the internet, moving those to the cloud and then reaching them into the cloud becomes even more complicated. So again, that may be a footprint that is very hard to move into the cloud and often runs very, very important applications for businesses, for government, for financial services, for insurance, and so on and so forth. And the last thing I'll put on the list, because I've gone through a long list of things, and again, none of these are meant to be, sort of trying to be a cheerleader for the data centers versus the cloud or completely knocking the cloud. It's, again, looking at, where are we in terms of cloud adoption? Where are areas that we may see improvement over time and increase adoption? The last one is, if you're going to move to the cloud, and you know this from if you listen to the show, we've had plenty of sponsors, CBT Nuggets, O'Reilly, A Cloud Guru. We've had others on the show in the past. Retraining is a huge demand. There's tons and tons of really good training that's out there. There are tons of people who want to continue to upskill their kind of uplift their skills, get better at things, get certified, improve their career. But those things take time. And if we put some things in perspective, right, we talked about cloud sort of, launching in 2007, 2008, but we didn't see even AWS having, their first $1 billion until roughly, I think it was 2012-ish. Now, granted, it's, ramped up significantly. All the clouds have ramped up significantly. But if you think about sort of expertise, sort of the Malcolm Gladwell 10,000 hour rule, that would essentially mean you would do cloud full time for 5 years, roughly 2,000 hours a year before you'd become an expert in that. And more we see, companies aren't necessarily investing in their people doing time to do training. A lot of people are having to do training outside of the office on their own personal time. And so, you have to think about retraining around cloud skills is going to take time, right? We're going to see an explosion of people who, have cloud skills. We see more and more ways that people can get them easily, can get them for free, don't need big in-home labs and all that stuff. But again, to have the generation of people that, had been working in data centers for a long time to begin to learn cloud skills is going to take some time. It's going to be a few more years. New people coming into the market, again, having them get experience as well as just certifications is going to take some time. So, again, that sort of to me is one of the last sort of legs of the stool, if you will, in terms of, we talked about technology, we talked about process, and then we talk about people. It's going to take some time. And, when you were talking about, say, the smartphone market and so forth, it took a little time for people to start to understand how to use the device and developers to sort of skill up for it. But again, you had very quick market consolidation. You had 2 essential standards, 2 marketplaces. And yes, some of the names were different on the phone, but essentially you narrowed down to 2. In the cloud space, we still have data center. We have, the big 3 cloud providers. We have IBM, we have Oracle, we have Alibaba, we have DigitalOcean, we have many others. So figuring out which one makes the most sense for you, and then having multiple layers of the stack, IaaS, PaaS, software as a service, security, desktop as a service, we still have a very broad footprint that people would have to get skilled up in. So with that, I think I've talked quite a bit about this. Again, I wanted to sort of lay this out, in the context of, where are we in terms of the speed at which cloud's being adopted? Is it growing fast? Yes. Is it growing fast enough? Well, it kind of depends on your perspective. But if we compare it to some other global phenomenons, it's not necessarily growing as fast. And obviously the reason being that global IT and cloud is probably a much more complicated environment. And so, we have to sort of temper how we expect to see sort of change happen and how fast it will happen. And you can think about that in the context of your own business, your own career, and so forth. So with that, I'm going to wrap up today's Sunday Perspectives. As always, glad to have everybody listening. We've seen a really nice uptick both in the listens for the Sunday show, but also just the show in general over the last couple of months. So really glad to see people coming back to the show. If you may have left during the pandemic, seeing people tell their friends, helping grow the community. We get numbers from around the world, and we're always continue to be amazed at the number of people that listen from around the world. And big thank you always to anybody who tells a friend, anybody who tells a colleague, anybody who reviews the show on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts from. So with that, we're going to wrap up, and we will talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to the Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.